Hey, my name is Chris Brennan, and this is your horoscope for Scorpio rising for the entire year ahead for 2021. So you can also look at this from the perspective of your sun sign if your sun is in Scorpio, or your moon sign if your moon is in Scorpio, but rising sign or ascendant sign in Scorpio is preferred because that'll be more specific to your actual birth chart. All right, let's go ahead and jump into it. So here's the planetary movements calendar that shows where the planets will start at the beginning of the year and what signs of the zodiac they'll move through by the end of the year. So in terms of some of the major transits I wanted to talk about for your year ahead forecast, the major one, of course, is Saturn and Jupiter have moved into Aquarius, which is your fourth house in your birth chart. So the fourth house is the house of the home, the living situation, the parents, and the private life in general, opposite to your 10th house, which is more about your public life. So Saturn moving into your fourth house for the next 3 years, it's actually a pretty long-term transit, and that can be kind of a heavy transit where it can bring some obstacles or difficulties to your home and living situation or to in relation to your parents and your family in general. So many of you should have gotten a preview of some of the themes that this will coincide with earlier in 2020 when Saturn transited through the sign of Aquarius. It just dipped into Aquarius for like a few months between early April and early July, I believe. So that could have been a more difficult period for some of those topics because Mars was transiting through that sign at the same time. It's not necessarily the case that this entire Saturn transit over the next 3 years will be as difficult as that was because Mars will not be moving through Aquarius at the same time like it was in 2020, but still you should have gotten a preview of some fourth house themes that should become relevant during the course of this Saturn transit. So good to go back and think about what happened in the second quarter of 2020 to get a preview of what that's all about. Some of the good news is that Jupiter will be moving through Aquarius at the same time, and that's actually the recent great conjunction which occurred in December in Aquarius was in your fourth house. So Jupiter, whereas Saturn is more about restrictions and limitations and obstacles, Jupiter is the opposite. It's more about growth and expansion and a sense of optimism. So that's one really positive thing that's happening this year is even though there's going to be some constriction and some obstacles coming up as a result of Saturn, there's also going to be some growth and expansion when it comes to fourth house matters pertaining to your home, your family, and your private life at the same time. And that Jupiter transit is going to be lasting for about 1 year, all the way until December of 2021. So it's going to be more or less relevant to you for the entirety of this year. So those two planets moving into Aquarius also ended a long 3-year transit of Saturn through your third house of siblings, communication, short distance travel, and education. So if there are any issues that were coming up in your life that pertain to those topics since December of 2017, the good news is that that long-term transit of obstacles and difficulties is now over. Additionally, as of January of this year, Mars is finally moving out of Aries and moving out of your sixth house, which is the house that has to do with health and work. And for some of you, this would have coincided with a period in the second half of 2020 when Mars went retrograde into Aries, where you had to expend a lot more energy in work and had to work a lot harder than at other times. For others, it may have coincided with a period of some health issues or some health setbacks in the second half of 2020. So the good news is that right at the top of the year, Mars is finally leaving that 6-month transit through Aries and it moves into Taurus on the 6th of January. So that's actually good news for those of you that were looking forward to getting out of some of those more difficult long-term third and sixth house transits that really came to a head in 2020, so most of last year. Other major transits I want to talk about are Uranus is transiting through your seventh house of relationships, and it's going to form 3 exact squares with Saturn over the course of this year. So that's kind of important because Uranus transiting through your seventh house of relationships is already a transit that may bring some unexpected disruptions, some new innovations, and general revolutions when it comes to the way that you relate to other people in your life one-on-one. If you're in a long-term relationship, then this may pertain to your relationship with your romantic partner. In some instances, it can also relate to business partners or other very close one-on-one relationships like that. But the general theme of Uranus is sometimes unexpected disruptions as the main keyword. So with Uranus squaring Saturn, which is transiting through your fourth house of your home and living situation and family, there could be some tension between those two areas of your life that comes to a head at different points during the course of 2021. So the three exact squares between Saturn and Uranus are going to take place between 7 degrees and 13 degrees of Aquarius and Taurus. So any of you with natal planets placed between 7 and 13 degrees of fixed signs, I think this is going to be the most sensitive degrees for you, or sensitive points for you during the course of 2021. So the first exact Saturn-Uranus square happens in mid-February at 7 degrees of Aquarius and Taurus. The second square happens June 14th at 13 degrees of Aquarius and Taurus. And then the third and final exact square occurs on December 24th, 2021 at 11 degrees of Aquarius and Taurus. So pay attention to those degrees and pay attention to those dates. So there are going to be a few points where Mars is going to transit through the fixed signs this year of Taurus, Leo, and Scorpio, and that could bring some additional trigger or additional sort of agitation, which could set off the Saturn-Uranus square and lead to a sort of galvanizing of events in those specific spheres of your life, specifically in the area of the 7th house of relationships and the 4th house of the home and living situation. Although in some instances, for example, when Mars goes through Leo, it could draw in some topics related to your career. And when Mars goes through Scorpio, it could draw in some topics related to your mind or your body. And sometimes that can be things related to your physical health, or in some instances, your mental health and well-being. So the specific dates for when Mars is really going to get tied in with the Mars-Saturn stuff are mid-January, January 13th through the 20th, when Mars squares Saturn and conjoins Uranus exactly. July 1st through the 3rd, when Mars opposes Saturn and squares Uranus. And then November 10th through the 17th, when Mars squares Saturn and Mars then opposes Uranus. So there's probably much broader periods of time where I would pay attention to not just Mars hitting those exact aspects, but also when it's moving through the fixed signs. Like, for example, in January, it moves into Taurus on the 6th, and it stays in that sign until it eventually moves into the following sign of Gemini on March 3rd. So that entire period is going to be operative for you in some ways, because Mars going through Taurus is going through your 7th house of relationships. So you should pay attention to the broader spans of time when Mars is moving through the fixed signs of Taurus, Leo, and Scorpio this year, but those specific dates that I gave you should be focal points when some of those energies activating the Saturn-Uranus square are going to be at their most acute or most intense in some ways. All right, so other things I want to touch on this year are the eclipses, which are going to take place in your 2nd house of finances, your 8th house of shared resources, and eventually your 7th house of relationships. So the first set of eclipses occurs in late May and early June, and this is a lunar eclipse in Sagittarius on May 26th, and a solar eclipse on June 10th in Gemini. So Sagittarius and Gemini are your 2nd house, 8th house axis, which has to do with, it's basically the financial axis in your chart primarily, which pertains to the 2nd house of your own personal resources and finances and possessions, and then the 8th house of shared resources, or the general topic of other people's money and the role that that plays in your life, which can extend to things like taxes, debt, inheritance, and other matters like that. The 8th also in traditional astrology has to do with mortality, and sometimes that can come into your life as a significant topic during this time in different ways. So my general keywords, or my main keywords for eclipses, is great beginnings and great endings. So you're going to see some great beginnings and endings when it comes to financial matters in your life this year. It's partially a continuation, though, of some themes that already started in 2020, because the eclipse series already um, started moving into these two signs of Sagittarius and Gemini starting by June of 2020. There was an eclipse in Sagittarius in your second house of finances, a little partial eclipse. It's a lunar eclipse. But then there was definitely already a couple of eclipses in Gemini and Sagittarius at the end of 2020, where there was a Gemini eclipse at the end of November, and then a Sagittarius eclipse on December 14th, which would have been in your second house. So some of these themes of great endings and beginnings in this sector of your chart already began and should already be in motion by the time you're watching this horoscope. And certainly by the time you get to those eclipses in the second quarter of 2021, some of those themes will already have been initiated and you'll already be experiencing some of the new beginnings and endings in the financial sector of your life. But good to pay attention to nonetheless. So that's the first set of eclipses. The second set of eclipses, we see the closing down of that cycle or series of eclipses in your second house with a total solar eclipse in Sagittarius on December 4th, which will bring to conclusion the sequence of events that have to do with your personal finances and personal possessions at that time will sort of be wrapped up and brought to completion around the time of that eclipse and in the 6 months following it. And what will happen then is we'll see the opening of a new series of eclipses, which begins on the Taurus-Scorpio axis, which is your axis of self and other, or basically where you're signified in the chart versus where relationships are signified in the chart, starting with the relationship eclipse, which is a lunar eclipse that occurs in Taurus on November 19th. So this is important because it's going to accentuate the Uranus transit that I talked about earlier that's already transiting through your seventh house of relationships for a 7-year period that it's only 2 years into, because Uranus first started dipping into Taurus in May of 2018, and then it fully moved in May of 2019. And that can coincide with a shakeup in relationships. But now this last lunar eclipse that's occurring in November of 2021 is going to indicate a culmination of events with respect to relationships. And it's going to open up a series of eclipses that are going to bounce back and forth between your seventh house of relationships and first house of self over the course of the next year and a half. So I wanted to mention that because even though it's not something that's going to be finished or come to conclusion by the end of 2021, it's going to open up a series of events in your life where relationships are going to take more of the focus leading into 2022. And we're going to see a lot of action in that sector of your chart, in that sector of your life, the relationship versus self sector, and defining yourself better in relation to others as you move into 2022. But when you look back on it years from now, you'll see that some of those trends and themes began in late 2021 with this eclipse that will take place in Taurus. So pay attention to some of the things that happen around that time. All right. The only other thing I wanted to mention is just Jupiter's ingress into your fifth house in late December when it moves into the sign of Pisces. So we can see right there, Jupiter moving into Pisces on December 28th, and that's, incredibly late in the year, and it means that Jupiter is going to be moving through Pisces for all of 2022. So that's a transit that normally I wouldn't really talk about or mention much because it's something that's more relevant to next year, to 2022, than it is this year. However, the reason I'm going to mention it is because Jupiter does make a brief dip into Pisces for a couple of months, starting in mid-May. So we see Jupiter dipping into Pisces on the 13th of May here. Then it will station retrograde at the first degree of Pisces on the solstice on June 20th. And then it will retrograde back into Aquarius at the very end of July on the 28th. So what that means is that because Jupiter is actually going to dip into Pisces for a couple of months there in the middle of 2021 or the second quarter of 2021, you want to pay attention to it because that's going to be a preview of some major themes that are going to come up in 2022. So Pisces for you is your fifth house, and the fifth house traditionally relates to topics such as children and the role that children play in your life, whether they're your own children, if you have any, or whether they're like other people's children. For example, if you were like a school teacher or something like that. Other fifth house topics are creativity and creative expression, pleasure in general, and also sex and sexuality are fifth house topics. So, with Jupiter moving into the fifth house, that's usually a period of growth and expansion in one or multiple areas related to the fifth house. So, children, it could be a good period with relation to children or to have children for some of you. For those of you that are artists or into creative expression, this could be a very positive period in which you're creating more and you're more successful in creating things than at other times. And also for some of you with Jupiter going through your fifth house, that could just be a good time for sexual exploration and growth and expansion in that area of your life compared to other years where maybe you don't have as much growth and expansion or what have you. So that's a transit that I would pay attention to because you're going to see some themes come up between May and July that might look not like a huge deal at the time. But once we go into 2022, you're going to find that transit becoming much more significant in your life and much more of a focal point next year. So pay attention to that little brief preview window that you get between May and July. All right, I think that is it, and those are the major transits that I wanted to mention for those of you with Scorpio rising for the year of 2021. So thanks a lot for watching this forecast. Good luck this year with your transits. Let me know how things go in the comments section, and I will see you again next year for the horoscope forecast for 2022. So good luck. Many of the images and calendars that were used in this episode are now available as posters on the astrologypodcast.com website. This includes our 2021 planetary alignments calendar, which shows all of the ingresses and retrogrades and lunations this year, the planetary movements calendar, which shows how far through the signs of the zodiac each of the planets will get during the course of 2021, and also other posters that we have, like our significations of the 12 houses poster, so that you can personalize and understand how each of these transits relates to your own birth chart. We also recently released our 2021 Auspicious Elections Full Year Ahead Electional Astrology Report, where Lisa Scheim and I went through each of the next 12 months and we picked out one lucky date, which would be good for launching new ventures and undertakings using the principles of electional astrology. So you can find out more about that report at chrisbrennanastrologer.com. Thanks to all the patrons that supported the production of this episode of the podcast through our page on Patreon. In particular, thanks to the patrons on our producers tier, including Nate Craddock, Marin Altman, Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Michelle Marilot, Christy Moe, Ariana Amor, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Sumo Kopic, and Nadia Habhab. For more information about how to become a patron or have your name listed in the credits, please visit patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Also, special thanks to our sponsors, including the Northwest Astrological Conference, which is happening online May 27th through the 31st, 2021. Find out more information at norwac.net. The Mountain Astrologer magazine, which you can find out more information about at mountainastrologer.com. The ISAR Astrology Conference happening August 18th through the 22nd, 2021. More information at isar2020.org. The Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs, which you can find out more information about at honeycomb.co. Also, the Portland School of Astrology, more information at portlandastrology.org. The AstroGold Astrology app, available for both iPhone and Android, available at astrogold.io. And finally, the primary software program that we use on episodes of the Astrology Podcast is called SolarFire Astrology Software, which is available at alabe.com, and you can get a 15% discount with the promo code AP15.